4. June 1942. Flag bridge and sick bay of the aircraft carrier Akagi, 200 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. The morning light on the Pacific is harsh and clean, the sky almost empty, the sea deceptively calm. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida lies in pain on a narrow bed below the bridge, his abdomen bound after surgery and an old ankle injury still troubling him, listening to the sounds that defined his entire wartime life. The rising whine of aircraft engines, the shouted cadence of deck crews, the ring of telephones from the operations room just overhead. Less than 6 months earlier, he had led the first wave against Pearl Harbor, circling above Battleship Row in the clear Hawaiian morning and sending back the coded report that every man in the Japanese combined fleet had prayed to hear. Now, grounded by illness on the day the combined fleet seeks its second decisive battle, he can only picture the flight deck above his head as the first strike group roars off toward Midway, bombers and fighters in carefully arranged formations, every element timed to the minute. The air smells of fuel and disinfectant, not gunpowder. Officers passing through the wardroom speak in low, confident voices of another great victory, of American carriers lured to their destruction, of the war's turning point about to be sealed. Through the steel above him comes the faint grinding of the rudder as Akagi adjusts course in perfect formation with Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the 4 carriers at the heart of the First Air Fleet. Fuchida closes his eyes and imagines the map in the operations room, the red symbols of Japanese strength stretching from the Aleutians to the Solomons, the arrows converging on a tiny dot in the Central Pacific. Everything about this morning, from the professional routines on the bridge to the rhythmic launch of aircraft, speaks of control, of a navy at the height of its power. Yet the plan unfolding over his head rests on a chain of assumptions, decisions, and habits formed in the months since Pearl Harbor. Decisions made by admirals who believe they are repeating their greatest success. Within hours, in the span of a single late morning and early afternoon, those decisions will turn that success into a trap of their own making, and Fuchida will live long enough to understand that what began as Japan's proudest triumph was made obsolete by its own architects. To understand why these men put so much faith in this plan, Fuchida's thoughts and our story move backward to another morning and another quiet sea. On 7th December 1941, he had stood in the cockpit of a Nakajima B-5N bomber over Oahu, leading 183 aircraft toward Pearl Harbor. At 7:49 a.m. Hawaiian time, he looked down and saw the American battleships lined up as they had been in reconnaissance photographs. Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, Nevada, Pennsylvania. His radio operator tapped out the signal confirming surprise, and wave after wave of torpedo bombers and dive bombers dropped down into the harbor. The shock of that attack reverberated across the world. In less than 2 hours, 4 American battleships were sunk, 4 damaged, over 180 aircraft destroyed, more than 2,400 Americans killed. What Fuchida could not see in that moment, but what the Japanese Naval General Staff celebrated in Tokyo, was the apparent validation of a strategy that predated the war. Lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet across the ocean into one decisive battle, destroy it in concentrated fashion, and force Washington to accept a negotiated peace that left Japan's new empire intact. Pearl Harbor seemed to improve on that blueprint. Instead of waiting for the Americans to advance, the combined fleet had smashed their battle line at anchor. But the reality beneath the headlines was more complicated. The 3 American carriers assigned to the Pacific Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga all happened to be at sea and survived untouched. The great fuel storage tanks, repair docks, and submarine facilities at Pearl Harbor, which sustained American operations across the Pacific, were left intact. Japanese pilots reported the success expected of them, and in his post-battle report, Fuchida described the scene of burning ships and exploding magazines with satisfaction. In later years, he would admit that none of them fully understood what they had failed to destroy. On paper, Japan had neutralized the American battle fleet. In practice, they had left the core of future American strength and mobility untouched, and they had awakened an industrial power whose productive potential was far beyond anything the Japanese admirals truly believed possible. In the months that followed, those admirals seemed determined to prove that Pearl Harbor had been the first in a chain of decisive strokes. Here, the documentary lens widens beyond Fuchida's hospital bed and beyond the echo of bombs in Hawaii. From December 1941 through the spring of 1942, Japanese forces surged across the map. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day, Singapore in February 1942, the Dutch East Indies in March. In little more than 3 months, Japan seized a defensive perimeter that stretched thousands of miles, bringing vital oil fields and raw materials under its control. At sea, the Imperial Japanese Navy swept Allied cruisers and destroyers aside in the Java Sea and the Indian Ocean, sinking the British carriers Hermes and the heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire, raiding as far as Ceylon. The First Air Fleet, with its 6 big carriers, appeared invincible. Yet each success hid structural problems. Japan had built only a handful of fleet carriers and trained only a few hundred elite aviators. Its shipyards and pilot schools could not replace losses quickly. Its leaders, especially Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, believed that time was against them. The United States had already begun shifting its enormous industry to war production. In 1941, American shipyards launched about 1.75 million tons of merchant shipping. By 1943, they would launch over 11 million tons in a single year. Battleships and carriers laid down before Pearl Harbor were coming down the ways one after another. Yamamoto, who had studied in the United States and seen its industrial base, warned his colleagues that for 6 months he could run wild, but after that, he could promise nothing. To break American morale before that moment came, he devised Operation MI, the seizure of Midway Atoll and the destruction of the remaining American carriers in one blow. Fuchida, recovering from appendicitis and still nursing injuries from long service, followed these plans as a staff officer. He listened to briefings describing Midway as bait, the carriers as the killing weapon, the Americans as predictable. There was confidence, bordering on certainty, that code security was intact, that enemy forces were weak, that the pattern of surprise achieved at Pearl Harbor could be repeated. No one in the operations rooms in Tokyo or aboard Akagi fully accepted that American cryptanalysts in Hawaii and Washington had broken key parts of the Japanese Naval Code, JN-25, and had identified Midway as the target. No one grasped that by May 1942, the United States had committed 3 carriers and dozens of escorts to an ambush at a point of their own choosing. The admirals who had approved Yamamoto's ambitious, complex plan saw it as a natural continuation of Pearl Harbor. It did not yet occur to them that the very logic that made Pearl Harbor seem brilliant was about to be reversed by their own overconfidence. Thus, the scene to which we return on the morning of 4th of June 1942 is not merely a tableau of ships at sea, but the culmination of this entire chain of decisions. As Akagi steams in formation, Fuchida hears reports filtering down. The first strike against Midway has taken off. The air crews are experienced men, many veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. Shortly after 6:30 a.m., messages begin to arrive from the strike leader, reporting damage to fuel tanks, hangars, and installations on the atoll, but also noting that Midway's air defenses are not fully suppressed. Almost simultaneously, reconnaissance planes begin to signal confusing sightings. A 10-ship enemy force to the northeast, position uncertain. Possible carriers, or perhaps only cruisers. On Akagi's bridge, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo faces the critical choice that will define the day. Doctrine and Yamamoto's plans say the second wave, held in reserve on the hangar decks armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for ship attack, should be kept ready for the American fleet. The immediate reports from Midway argue for a second strike against the island to finish the job. Nagumo hesitates. Then at 7:15 a.m., orders the reserve planes to be rearmed for another land attack. Below, armorers begin the slow, dangerous process of removing torpedoes and heavy bombs, hauling out land attack weapons and rearranging fuel lines among dozens of aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip in enclosed hangars. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu all begin this delicate work, their decks now cluttered with fueled aircraft and live ordnance. What Nagumo does not know, what Yamamoto's distant flagship cannot tell him in time, and what Fuchida lying in sickbay cannot see, is that 3 American carriers are already in position. Thanks to broken codes and a calculated risk, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown have arrived northeast of Midway with roughly 233 aircraft. They are not being lured, they are hunting. In the hours that follow, as fragments of messages, urgent course changes, and the distant thump of anti-aircraft guns reach Fuchida's ears, the logic of Pearl Harbor begins to turn inside out. The same concentration of precious carriers in one striking force, the same reliance on perfect timing, the same belief in surprise and superiority, will collide with an enemy that has learned, adapted, and is willing to throw uncoordinated, costly attacks at the first air fleet until one of them lands. By late morning, in one brief window of clear sky and fatal visibility, decisions made by Japanese admirals over many months will make the triumph of Pearl Harbor not only irrelevant, but impossible to repeat. Fuchida feels the first tremor through the deck shortly after 7 o'clock a.m. A subtle change in the sound of the ship as Akagi increases speed and leans into a new course. An orderly comes through sick bay with a brief update. Enemy aircraft from Midway have attacked, but the combat air patrol and anti-aircraft guns have driven most of them off. From where he lies, he can picture it clearly. American torpedo bombers coming in low, too slow, too exposed, meeting the same skilled Zero pilots who had torn into American and British formations since the start of the war. He has seen this imbalance with his own eyes at Pearl Harbor and in the Indian Ocean. Poorly coordinated enemy attacks, brave but wasteful, broken up in the outer ring. When he is helped up the ladder toward the island structure to get closer to the information center, he sees no smoke on the horizon from Japanese ships, only the bright white wakes of the carriers and their escorts as they maneuver. The faces around him remain composed. Reports confirm minor damage to some destroyers and near misses, but no ship lost. He hears that the first Midway strike has not silenced the airfields completely, that Nagumo has therefore continued rearming the reserve aircraft for a second land attack. To a man like Fuchida, trained in the doctrine of the First Air Fleet, the logic feels familiar. Use the first blow to paralyze the base, follow with a second to crush any remaining resistance, and prepare to meet the enemy fleet when it inevitably appears. This was the pattern they had expected at Pearl Harbor had the American carriers been present. Now they believe they can force that decisive battle near Midway. The yasao, sounds of chains, bomb carts, and shouted orders from below signal that dozens of planes are being changed over from anti-ship to land attack roles. Fuchida, still weakened, says little, but notes quietly that the work is taking longer than theory ever allowed for. Live torpedoes must be moved aside. Armor-piercing bombs, designed to punch through decks of battleships, are stacked awkwardly in hangars. Aviation fuel lines snake across spaces already crowded with machines. It is complex, delicate work, and the carriers are doing it while under intermittent threat. In his mind, still shaped by professional pride, he trusts in discipline and training to manage the risk. What he cannot change, and what the documentary record lays bare, is the strategic frame forced upon Nagumo and the other admirals long before this morning. Their confidence rests on assumptions that had their roots in 7th of December 1941 and in earlier war games in Tokyo. The Pearl Harbor attack, for all its dramatic impact, had also trained them to believe that surprise and concentrated carrier power, applied with flawless timing, would always offset numerical and industrial inferiority. In the 6 months since then, they had dispersed forces to cover simultaneous operations in the Aleutians and at Midway, extended thin reconnaissance screens across a vast ocean, and insisted on maintaining strict radio silence. Yamamoto's plan placed the main body of battleships hundreds of miles behind Nagumo's carriers, too distant to influence events on the 4th of June. Japanese scouts, few in number, and limited by range and doctrine, left gaps through which the American carriers were already slipping. On the other side, American cryptanalysts at Station HIPO and elsewhere had, by May, reconstructed enough of the Japanese code to know that AF meant Midway and that a major operation was scheduled for early June. This allowed Admiral Chester Nimitz to concentrate Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown northeast of the atoll, with orders to strike the moment the Japanese carriers revealed themselves. At Midway itself, Marine and Navy pilots in obsolete aircraft and untested squadrons were ready to fly what for many would be one-way missions. In the hours after dawn, their attacks are slaughtered in pieces. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet loses 29 of 30 men. Others meet similar fates. These numbers, which look like failure in isolation, form part of a larger picture the Japanese admirals did not anticipate. A relentless pattern of pressure that keeps Nagumo's decks too busy to complete rearming in safety, that forces his combat air patrol to constantly turn, climb, dive, refuel, and rearm, and that drives his decision-making closer to the edge. The doctrine born from Pearl Harbor had assumed a passive enemy, arriving on schedule for destruction. On this day, the enemy arrives early, disorganized but informed, and is willing to pay dearly in planes and lives to hold the Japanese carriers in a vulnerable posture. Shortly after 8:00 a.m., as more fragmented reconnaissance signals arrive, Nagumo learns with greater certainty that American surface forces, including what may be carriers, have been sighted to the northeast. Fuchida, now in the operations space, listens as staff officers argue over whether to complete the land attack rearming or revert to anti-ship loads. The signal from the scout plane of Cruiser Tone, delayed at launch and late in its report, finally clarifies that ships, apparently including a carrier, have been spotted. The room tightens. The decision that should have been clear at dawn, to keep a reserve armed for ships, must now be reversed again under pressure. Orders go out to switch back to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Armorers and deck crews begin another dangerous cycle of changing loads, hauling weapons in and out, rolling heavy explosives across steel floors, while aviation gasoline fumes linger in the air. Aircraft that had been brought up to the flight deck are sent below. Fuel lines, hoses, and bomb carts crisscross spaces that doctrine had once imagined as neatly organized. It is at this moment, with the carriers heavily committed to rearming, with many aircraft below deck, with anti-aircraft crews watching the sky for the next wave from Midway, that the American attack from the carriers finally begins to take shape. Torpedo squadrons, arriving ahead of schedule or separated from their escorts, fall upon Nagumo's formation one after another and are cut down. From Akagi's island, Fuchida, leaning on the rail, sees columns of water erupt near Kaga as torpedoes miss and shells explode. He watches Zero fighters, low on fuel, throwing themselves into defense with skill that had impressed allies and enemies alike. To the officers around him, these repulsed attacks confirm their belief in Japanese superiority. The enemy is brave but clumsy, sending their torpedo planes in low without coordination, easy prey to experienced fighter pilots. Nagumo, seeing one wave after another destroyed before they can score a hit, believes he still has time to complete his changeover and launch a crushing counterstrike against the newly discovered American carriers. The information he holds, filtered through delay and uncertainty, supports his confidence. The information he lacks, available to us in hindsight, reveals how narrow the margin has become. While his carriers hurry to rearm, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown are homing in, guided by last known positions and a sequence of navigational choices that will intersect with Nagumo's task force at precisely the worst possible moment for Japan. At 10:20 a.m., the balance shaped since Pearl Harbor breaks in less than 5 minutes. From Akagi's bridge, those who are there will later remember the sudden cry of lookouts, the dark shapes of SBD Dauntless dive bombers appearing almost directly overhead out of a gap in the clouds, diving steeply toward Kaga and then Soryu, their wings glinting in the sun. In the sick bay and passageways below, Fuchida hears the distinct rising whine of diving aircraft and the staccato roar of every gun on the fleet opening up at once. He drags himself back to a vantage point as the first bombs strike. On Kaga, 3, then 4 hits tear into a flight deck crowded with fueled aircraft and stacked bombs. Flames leap up so quickly that within minutes she is a single sheet of fire. Soryu takes 3 direct hits that detonate in her hangars, blowing out her sides and driving men overboard. Akagi herself, pride of the First Air Fleet, is struck by one bomb near the aft edge of her flight deck, with a near miss that lifts her hull. That single hit is enough. It punches through into a hangar full of armed and fueled planes. Secondary explosions race along the deck. Fuchida is thrown to the floor as the ship shudders. The air fills with smoke and the smell of burning oil. He sees men scrambling with hoses far too small for the wall of flame. He hears the muffled blasts as gasoline tanks and torpedoes cook off. Hiryu, slightly apart from the other 3, escapes this first wave of destruction and will launch the counterattacks that damage Yorktown later in the day, but the decisive moment has already passed. In less time than Fuchida's Pearl Harbor strike took to unfold, 3 of Japan's frontline carriers are mortally wounded, and the 4th is isolated. The very concentration of strength that had made Pearl Harbor possible has become a point of catastrophic vulnerability under the gaze of an enemy that has learned where to strike. In this brief window, the strategic method that the Japanese admirals believed they were perfecting reveals its fatal flaw. The victory at Pearl Harbor had assumed carriers could strike first, unseen, and retire before a superior enemy could respond. At Midway, in this late morning on the 4th June, Japan's naval leaders discover that against an opponent with intelligence, radar, and growing carrier skill of its own, that method no longer guarantees safety. It invites disaster. Fuchida will survive Akagi's burning, carried off the doomed ship, and later asked to help reconstruct the events for official reports. Fuchida will survive Akagi's burning, carried off the doomed ship, and later asked to help reconstruct the events for official reports. And in those reports, and in his later writings, he will fix this moment in memory as the point when Japanese naval air power broke. He does not yet know how completely. As he watches men abandon ship, as he feels the heat from fires that cannot be controlled with the pumps and hoses on board, he senses only that something essential has been reversed. The side that once struck undetected at Pearl Harbor has now been caught exposed by an enemy that knew where to look. Above the smoke and confusion, the principles that guided Japanese planning since before 1941 are coming apart in real time. The idea that carefully husbanded elite air crews on a few irreplaceable carriers could decide the war in one or two battles has met a different reality. An opponent willing to spend aircraft and pilots at a rate Japan cannot match, supported by yards and factories already producing new ships, new planes, and new weapons in numbers no Tokyo staff study ever fully credited. In that sense, the destruction that engulfs Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu in this late morning sun does more than sink 3 carriers. In a single concentrated blow, it makes the Pearl Harbor model of victory obsolete. From this point onward, Japan will continue to fight with skill and courage in many seas, but the strategic pattern has turned against it. The carriers that delivered the stunning success of December 1941 are gone or soon to be lost, and the industrial balance that lay behind America's recovery will now dictate the course of the Pacific War with a force no afternoon's tactics can reverse. Fuchida lies in the wardroom of the cruiser Nagara, the temporary flagship for what remains of the once proud First Air Fleet, as the smell of burned oil and scorched paint lingers in the air. The sea around Midway is littered with debris, rafts, fuel slicks, fragments of aircraft. On the horizon, the distant glow of burning ships marks where Kaga and Soryu are slipping under, and Akagi herself, still afloat, but mortally wounded, will be scuttled by her own destroyers before dawn. The shock is physical, numbing, almost impossible to translate into words. Officers move quietly through the passageways, speaking in low voices, their faces expressionless. The few surviving pilots who return are exhausted, hollow-eyed, some still in flight suits torn by shrapnel. Fuchida listens to their reports, piecing together the sequence of events that turned confidence into catastrophe. The delayed reconnaissance, the rearming order, the sudden dive bomber attack from the clouds. Each link in the chain seems small, rational in isolation, yet together they formed a perfect alignment of vulnerability. In the official tone of after-action summaries, it will later be called an unfortunate coincidence. But in his private notes, Fuchida writes the words that will haunt him. We had learned nothing from Pearl Harbor. What had once seemed proof of flawless planning was now exposed as habit, a reflex to believe that victory came from surprise, from daring, from the bold stroke, rather than from preparation and endurance. As night falls over the wreckage, the surviving ships begin their slow withdrawal westward, toward the safety of the home islands. The Japanese fleet has lost 4 fleet carriers, over 250 aircraft, and more than 3,000 men. The Americans, though bloodied, still hold 3 carriers and the atoll itself. The balance that had begun to tip after Coral Sea now swings decisively. In this moment of silence broken only by engines and distant explosions, Fuchida begins to understand that the empire's rapid expansion since December 1941 has reached its peak, and that the downward slope of decline has begun. At the same time, across the Pacific, the broader machinery of war moves with growing momentum. In American shipyards from Puget Sound to Newport News, new Essex-class carriers are already taking shape. Each one displaces over 27,000 tons and carries more than 90 aircraft, more than twice the number Akagi carried at Pearl Harbor. By the end of 1943, 12 will be afloat, followed by dozens more escort carriers that will fill the ocean like moving airfields. In the factories of Seattle, Fort Worth, and San Diego, production of aircraft has reached a scale Japan can scarcely imagine. 48,000 planes built in 1942, nearly 86,000 in 1943. Every American pilot lost at Midway can be replaced within weeks. Every plane shot down will have 3 waiting to take its place. By contrast, Japan's Naval Aviation Training Program produces only a few hundred new pilots each year, and fuel shortages begin to limit flight hours. While Fuchida nurses his wounds and the Imperial Navy buries its dead, the United States reorganizes under Admiral Nimitz and prepares for a counteroffensive that will roll across the Central Pacific. The lessons of Midway shape every decision. Decentralize air operations, emphasize radar control, coordinate task forces, and above all, exploit mass production. In the strategic calculus of modern war, Pearl Harbor's shock had depended on scarcity, on the ability of one well-trained force to cripple a stronger enemy through surprise. Midway reveals that in an industrial war, surprise cannot sustain momentum without the factories, fuel, and logistics to reinforce it. The admirals who built their doctrine around the decisive battle have been overtaken by a system that can generate continuous battles without exhaustion. Fuchida senses this truth not through statistics, but through the faces of the younger officers who now whisper doubts where certainty once ruled. The aura of invincibility is gone. Back in Tokyo, in the weeks following the disaster, the Naval General Staff struggles to comprehend the scale of the loss. Official communiques speak of a tactical setback, of the sacrifice of brave men. But in private meetings, the tone is grim. Admiral Yamamoto himself, the architect of both Pearl Harbor and Midway, sits in silence as damage reports arrive. 4 of 6 first-line carriers gone, 248 aircraft destroyed, 110 veteran pilots lost, the core of naval aviation erased in one day. The fleet that had struck from the Aleutians to the Indian Ocean is now a hollow shell, relying on half-trained replacements and obsolete aircraft. Japan still controls vast territories, Burma, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, but its navy has lost the ability to project power beyond them. The Americans, with their surviving carriers and growing industrial base, can now dictate when and where the next engagement will occur. Yamamoto, normally reserved, is reported to have said simply, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant." His words, often quoted in later years, capture the essence of what Fuchida and every officer aboard Akagi came to realize, that Pearl Harbor's brilliance had depended on ignorance, of the enemy's capacity, of the reach of its machines, of the resolve of its people. By June 1942, that ignorance was gone. American cryptographers, pilots, and admirals had studied every Japanese success and turned its principles against their creators. The decisive battle Japan had sought had arrived, but not on its terms. In a single afternoon, the Imperial Navy had learned that the doctrine of offensive concentration, once its strength, was now its weakness. For Fuchida, recovery is slow and bitter. He spends the remainder of 1942 in hospital, then in staff posts, analyzing reports from Guadalcanal and the Solomons where Japan's remaining carriers struggle to hold their own. Each new battle follows the same pattern. Courageous strikes, limited results, rising losses that cannot be replaced. He watches as the names of comrades disappear from rosters, as fuel and aircraft shortages force the Navy to conserve its strength, as the once formidable training programs shrink to shadows of their former selves. In late 1943, while American fleets hammer Japanese bases in the Gilberts and Marshalls, Fuchida is assigned to an administrative role, far from combat. By then, the doctrine of the decisive battle still appears in official manuals but has lost its meaning. What began as a theory of controlled destruction has devolved into desperate defense. From his desk, Fuchida studies reports of American shipbuilding output, figures so vast they read like propaganda. 45 aircraft carriers, 350 destroyers, 50,000 landing craft, millions of tons of cargo ships. These numbers dwarf everything the Japanese Empire can produce. He begins to understand that the tragedy of Midway was not only in the loss of ships or men, but in the exposure of an entire philosophy of war. Pearl Harbor had been designed to strike fear and force a compromise. Instead, it bound the United States to total mobilization. Midway revealed what that mobilization meant. The admirals who crafted the strategy had proven their courage and skill, but in clinging to the dream of one decisive battle, they had made their masterpiece obsolete in a single afternoon. By the beginning of 1944, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's health has largely recovered, but the Navy he once served with pride is no longer the same. The Imperial Navy that set the Pacific ablaze in 1941 now spends its days repairing, retreating, and rationing fuel. From his post as a staff officer at the Naval Air Training Command near Yokosuka, Fuchida receives reports from every front: New Guinea, the Solomons, the Central Pacific, and each tells the same story: attrition. The great battles that the admirals once envisioned as singular, decisive encounters have devolved into a slow grinding war of resources. In the skies over Rabaul, veteran Zero pilots are replaced by boys barely 20 years old. Fuel shortages cut training flights to a fraction of what they had been for Midway. Factories in Nagoya and Kure, battered by American air raids, cannot produce engines fast enough. Fuchida reads the numbers carefully, knowing what they mean. Japan has lost nearly 2/3 of its trained carrier airmen since June 1942. In that same time, American carrier forces have expanded tenfold. In October 1943, when American planes strike Wake Island, the defending Japanese pilots are shot down almost to the last man. The intelligence section at Yokosuka lists the output of American shipyards for that year: 1,500 warships, 65,000 aircraft, 8.6 million tons of merchant shipping, and the figures are so vast that they feel fictional. Fuchida keeps silent when junior officers speak of victory, but in his notes he writes, "The Empire is fighting ghosts." The Pearl Harbor Doctrine, built on surprise and speed, has met the industrial age head-on and failed. In the broader perspective, 1944 becomes the year when Midway's consequences materialize beyond debate. The Americans launch Operation Galvanic in the Gilbert Islands, followed by Operation Flintlock in the Marshalls. The carrier task forces, once the jewel of Japan's offensive strength, are now the instrument of its encirclement. At Kwajalein, the United States employs 300 ships, 800 aircraft, and 41,000 men, numbers that dwarf anything Japan can field. By June, the invasion of Saipan brings the war to Japan's doorstep, within bomber range of Tokyo. Fuchida studies the reports from the Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought that same month, and realizes that the ghost of Pearl Harbor has finally been exorcised. In that vast engagement, known later as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan loses more than 350 aircraft in 2 days, along with 3 carriers. The Americans lose barely 30 planes. The ratio is so lopsided that even the most loyal staff officers stop using the phrase decisive battle. For the first time, Japan's fleet withdraws not to regroup for another strike, but to preserve what little remains. The same tactical courage that had fueled the raid on Pearl Harbor now serves only to delay defeat. In the aftermath, Admiral Toyota admits privately that the war can no longer be won at sea. The industrial logic of Midway, the one that turned Pearl Harbor's strategy obsolete, has now reached its inevitable conclusion. The United States can lose ships and replace them within months. Japan cannot. Fuchida, assigned as a liaison officer during the defense of the Philippines later that year, witnesses firsthand how total the reversal has become. The once proud carriers are gone, and Japan's remaining aircraft are now scattered across island bases, their pilots undertrained, their planes underfueled. When he arrives at Manila in late 1944, he finds airfields bombed daily, supply lines broken, and morale collapsing. On October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, he watches from the ground as what remains of the Imperial Navy sails to its final confrontation. The plan, another attempt at a decisive battle, is bold but desperate. Admiral Kurita's center force, led by battleships Yamato and Musashi, aims to ambush American transports in Leyte Gulf. To lure the enemy northward, Admiral Ozawa sacrifices the last carriers as bait. The strategy mirrors Pearl Harbor's logic: surprise, concentration, and one stroke of overwhelming force. But the Americans now have radar, reconnaissance, and overwhelming numbers. Within 2 days, Japan loses Musashi, 4 carriers, and thousands of sailors. The decoy fleet succeeds in drawing attention, but the cost is catastrophic. When the battle ends, the Imperial Navy is no longer a fleet. It is a memory. In the quiet afterward, Fuchida writes a single line in his diary: "The dream of one decisive blow died at Leyte." It is not poetry, only observation. For the first time in modern Japanese history, the sea that once protected the homeland has become the route of invasion. As 1945 begins, Fuchida returns to Tokyo under orders to assist in staff evaluations for homeland defense. The capital he left in triumph 4 years earlier is unrecognizable. Streets blacked out at night, ration lines stretching for blocks, and the distant rumble of American B-29s crossing the sky toward industrial targets. He reads reports of air raids that destroy Nagoya, Osaka, and Yokohama in single nights, hundreds of thousands of homes burned, tens of thousands dead. The factories that once produced Japan's naval aircraft now lie in ruins. The Yamato, symbol of Japan's pride, is sunk in April 1945 on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa. The strategy of Pearl Harbor, which once promised to buy time and space for negotiation, has ended in national exhaustion. On 15th of August 1945, when Emperor Hirohito's voice echoes over the radio announcing surrender, Fuchida stands among other officers in silence. No one salutes, no one speaks. The war that began with precision, surprise, and confidence ends in ruin. Its architects gone, its navy destroyed, its empire dissolved. Later, when Fuchida writes his memoirs, he will return to that single afternoon at Midway and call it the moment everything changed. The gods of war, had turned their faces from Japan. But historians will phrase it differently. The admirals who built Pearl Harbor's strategy made it obsolete the moment they believed it could not fail. In the months that follow Japan's surrender, Mitsuo Fuchida returns to a homeland transformed by ruin. The once bustling Yokosuka naval base lies silent. The airfields he once commanded are littered with wreckage, burned aircraft, twisted hangars, stripped engines scavenged by civilians for scrap. The empire that had stretched across half the Pacific has collapsed into a landscape of ashes and silence. American occupation troops now walk through Tokyo streets, where once only Japanese uniforms were seen. The Imperial Navy no longer exists. Its ships lie scuttled, rusting, or sunk. Yet amid the devastation, Fuchida feels an unexpected calm. For the first time since he climbed into his plane on the morning of December 7, 1941, he is free from illusion. The strategy that shaped his entire career, the belief that Japan could achieve victory through one overwhelming blow, has been exposed not as a miscalculation, but as a fundamental misunderstanding of modern war. The evidence lies all around him. The railways that still run are powered by American fuel. The skies above are filled with Allied transport planes bringing food and medicine. And the factories, when they begin to hum again under American supervision, reveal the truth he first glimpsed at Midway. That industrial power, not tactical brilliance, determines survival in the 20th century. The occupation authorities begin documenting the war's origins and consequences. Allied teams interview Japanese officers, including Fuchida, about the planning and execution of Pearl Harbor. They ask precise questions: who decided the timing, what intelligence was available, how the Navy assessed American capacity for resistance. Fuchida answers factually, but as he speaks, he becomes aware of a deeper irony. In 1941, Japan's admirals had believed that America was too divided, too soft, too commercially obsessed to sustain a long war. Yet in 1945, that same nation has defeated not only Japan, but also Germany and Italy, and is rebuilding its former enemies with an efficiency and generosity unmatched in history. The idea of decisive battle, the cornerstone of Japanese naval doctrine since the time of Admiral Togo, has vanished. War is no longer decided by fleet engagements, but by systems: industrial, logistical, and informational. The Americans proved this at Midway, when intelligence, code-breaking, and radar combined to deliver precision beyond the range of any gun. They proved it again with the atomic bomb, which reduced the concept of decisive battle to irrelevance in a single flash over Hiroshima. As historians and investigators assemble records, Fuchida reads their summaries with growing clarity. The strategy that made Pearl Harbor possible was not defeated in combat. It was outdated before the first bomb fell on Oahu. The wider world moves quickly. In 1946, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East convenes in Tokyo. Former prime ministers, generals, and admirals stand accused of waging aggressive war. Fuchida, though deeply involved in the war's early planning, is called only as a witness. He testifies calmly about the attack on Pearl Harbor, how it was conceived as a preventive measure, how Japan believed that striking first would force negotiation rather than total war. Listening to the prosecutors read casualty numbers, production figures, and logistical reports, Fuchida realizes how far the Japanese leadership had misjudged the United States. At the time of Pearl Harbor, America had built only 6 fleet carriers. By 1945, it possessed over 100. The steel output that Japan's Navy planners thought unreachable, 3 million tons a year, was in reality 65 million. Every assumption had been wrong. When the court adjourns each day, Fuchida walks through the shattered remains of Tokyo's Ginza district, where black market stalls now replace department stores, and he wonders how men as educated and disciplined as Japan's admirals could have misread their world so completely. It was not arrogance, he decides, but faith in an outdated formula. The attack on Pearl Harbor had succeeded so brilliantly that it blinded its architects to the possibility of failure. Success became proof of correctness, even as the war's deeper logic turned against them. By 1947, Fuchida lives quietly near Osaka, growing vegetables and writing notes for what will one day become his memoir. He spends long hours rereading wartime documents, reconstructing from memory the debates that led to Midway. In them, he sees not villains but men trapped by their own training. They had been taught that the fleet was sacred, that risk must be minimized, and that every war would be decided by one great encounter. But the age of single battles was already over. The Americans had replaced it with the age of continuous warfare, factories as arsenals, carriers as mobile cities, supply chains as weapons. Fuchida studies photographs of American shipyards at Puget Sound and Newport News. Rows of carriers under construction, cranes the size of battleships, welders working day and night. He realizes that by 1942, Japan could never have matched such power, regardless of tactics. What Midway revealed was not a single defeat, but a structural impossibility. The Pearl Harbor strategy was obsolete because it sought to win a modern war with a 19th century mindset. Its admirals believed in brilliance, their opponents believed in production, and production won. As an old man, Fuchida will write that lesson in the simplest terms possible. We had built a sword, but they had built a factory. By the early 1950s, Japan begins to rise again, and so does Fuchida's reflection on the war that shaped his life. Reconstruction brings factories back to life, trains run on time, and school children study under the flag of a new democracy. For a man who once carried out the deadliest strike in Japanese naval history, the sight of American engineers helping rebuild bridges and ports feels surreal. Fuchida, no longer a soldier, earns a modest living writing and lecturing about his wartime experiences. His memoirs describe the Pacific conflict not as a contest of valor, but as an education in limits. He writes that the war was a teacher that spared no student, and Japan, having learned through defeat, must now understand the true lesson, that power without adaptability is illusion. In the years after the war, he meets several of his former adversaries, American pilots who had fought at Midway and Leyte. They speak openly, even warmly, about tactics and technology, and for the first time Fuchida hears their perspective on Pearl Harbor. Admiration for its execution, pity for its consequences. One of them tells him, "You fought as if courage could replace steel." The words sting but ring true. Courage and skill had carried Japan through its first victories. Steel and oil carried America through the rest. The contrast explains everything. By 1951, Japan signs the Treaty of San Francisco, officially ending the state of war. Fuchida watches on radio broadcasts as Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida affirms Japan's renunciation of aggression. For the nation, it marks a new beginning. For Fuchida, it is closure. He studies how American aid and Japanese discipline combined to rebuild cities faster than anyone thought possible. In this piece, he finds the final answer to the question that haunted him since Midway: why Japan's admirals failed to see the world as it was. They had been masters of maneuver, but blind to momentum. They saw war as a series of duels, not as an industrial current. The decisive battle they sought had occurred, but not in the form they imagined. It was fought in shipyards, in supply depots, in the endless flow of fuel and raw material. Midway had merely revealed the outcome already written in the ledgers of production. The 4 carriers lost, there were symbols of a system that had reached its natural limit. Japan could build machines of exquisite design, but not in endless quantity. Its admirals had made the Pearl Harbor strategy obsolete because they mistook precision for permanence. In his later years, Fuchida travels abroad, lecturing on the Pacific War for audiences curious about Japan's former naval might. In the United States, he visits the USS Enterprise's surviving veterans, who greet him without hostility. He is struck by how they speak of Midway as a test of endurance rather than glory. To them, the battle's meaning lies not in destruction, but in what it proved: that a democracy could outplan, outbuild, and outlast a disciplined empire. The contrast humbles him. He remembers the burning decks, the screaming engines, and the disciplined voices of Japanese sailors who fought to the last, believing they were defending an unshakable truth. Now he sees that truth clearly. The Pearl Harbor strategy was not wrong in spirit, but in scale. It belonged to an age when surprise could still decide empires. The modern world belongs to those who prepare, not those who gamble. Standing on an American dockyard in 1955, he watches an aircraft carrier twice the size of Akagi being constructed with cranes that move like clockwork. "We fought men who built worlds," he writes afterward, "and we tried to defeat them with courage." When Fuchida dies in 1976, newspapers describe him simply as the man who led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yet those who knew him remember something else. A man who spent 30 years teaching that war's greatest defeat was not military, but philosophical. The Pearl Harbor strategy, so bold, so daring, so precise, had been rendered obsolete the instant Japan mistook shock for strength. Its admirals had chased the dream of one perfect strike, blind to a truth Midway revealed to the world: that in the age of machines, victory belongs not to those who strike first, but to those who endure longest. The fleets sank, the empires crumbled, but the lesson remained. For Fuchida, that knowledge became both burden and redemption. In his final notes, he wrote a line that historians often quote to close the story of Japan's war: "We believed that one afternoon could decide a century. We were wrong. It only proved whose century it would be."